Today let's look at the poster boys of the Space Marine world, the Ultramarines. They like to walk at you, laying down massive amounts of bolt fire, because that's just how tactical they are. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-based 40k channel, where we're currently looking at how the new Space Marines can best purge the Xenos and Heretics from the tabletops of the 41st millennium. As the descendants of Rebute Guilliman himself, the Ultramarines are the exemplar chapter of the Codex Astartes, and over the years they've amassed countless deeds of heroism and victories against insurmountable odds. A large amount of the second founding chapters are descended from the Ultramarines, as they didn't actually suffer that many losses during the Horus Heresy, and they hail from Ultramar, which is, as it goes, a fairly civilized and unscarred part of the Imperium, which is saying something, seeing as quite a lot of the Imperium is a bit of a grim place to live in the first place. So let's see what these big blue Space Marines can do on the battlefield then. The Ultramarines chapter tactic is called Codex Discipline. Firstly, you add 1 to the leadership of all your Space Marine units, and if they fall back from combat, then they can still shoot in their following shooting phase, but they do so at a -1 penalty to hit on the shots. Now the leadership buff isn't really anything to write home about. Most of the time your Space Marine units won't be failing morale tests anyway, due to "and they shall know no fear." But this extra pip of leadership really helps to hammer home that you really shouldn't be taking any casualties from morale at all unless you're very unlucky. The main part of the stratagem is the fall back and shoot ability. This is actually a really nice benefit to have on a gunline army, as it takes away your opponent's ability to counter any of your ground-based units by just tagging them in close combat and taking away their ability to shoot next turn. Obviously, fly units have this anyway, so it doesn't add anything to them. So the chapter tactic mainly only adds real benefits to your ground-based Ultramarines forces. Incidentally, Games Workshop FAQ'd it, so the chapter tactic doesn't actually make flyers worse, because before they clarified it, the Ultramarines chapter tactic would usually give the flying units a -1 to hit when they fell back, even though they wouldn't usually get that if they fell back to shoot normally, so I'm glad that they cleared that up. It's good on anything that wants to be shooting more than it wants to be fighting in close combat, but is particularly good on, say, ground-based tanks, shooty dreadnoughts such as the Leviathan, or possibly things like aggressors and centurions, which would often like to have the option of firing off all of their bolt shots instead of using their power fists. Speaking of aggressors, let's move on to their enhanced doctrine. This is called Scions of Guilliman, and it's an improvement for the tactical doctrine, and it is a very strong buff indeed. Essentially, when you're in the tactical doctrine, which will typically be on turn 2, all of your Ultramarines units can move and then still fire all of their weapons as if they remained stationary that turn, provided they didn't fall back or advance. Now this is a huge buff for a number of reasons. Firstly, it will impact all of your heavy weapons, so they won't suffer the -1 to hit when moving. This is really quite good for gun lines because it removes the incentive to stay still to get the maximum amount of firepower. You can reposition your heavy units each turn, which will be great for getting line of sight on key units, maybe getting in range with some of your heavy weapons, or perhaps even falling back and getting out of range of some of the enemy's guns, and you still get to fire your heavy weapons on full effect. Bear in mind that this will be in the tactical doctrine, so that the heavy weapons won't be getting the extra AP -1, but it's still a very strong buff indeed. Secondly, counting as remaining stationary in the movement phase will allow you to use the bolter discipline rule more efficiently on your rapid-fire weapons. This mainly applies to rapid-fire weapons on vehicles and on infantry, as bikes, centurions, terminators, and dreadnoughts get it all the time. But for example, your intercessors, they'll be able to move 6 inches forwards, then rapid-fire their bolters all the way out to 30-inch range, so that's really quite a long range for taking out backfield enemy targets. And as I said, mobility is very useful for optimally positioning your units. It's also useful on any vehicle that has a rapid-fire weapon, such as the amount of storm bolters that you can put onto Space Marine tanks. When a tank can move and then still fire off 4 strength 4 AP -1 shots for 2 points, that firepower can really add up over the course of a game. This will also affect any vehicle-mounted Hurricane bolters, such as say the Storm Ravens Hurricane bolter sponsons and the Land Raider Crusaders Hurricane bolters. Despite power of the machine spirit, they still don't get to move and rapid fire their bolt weapons, so it's actually really quite a nice buff on these guys. 24 strength 4 AP -1 shots is going to ruin a lot of things there. And finally, this rule also applies to units that have a special rule for gaining additional shots or gaining additional benefits if they remain stationary or moved less than a certain amount. The two that spring to mind immediately are the Aggressors and the Repulsor Executioner. Ultramarines aggressors are hilariously brutal in shooting, as they can move 5 inches forward and then still double fire all of their guns, as they'll be AP -1 to boot. One of the main drawbacks with aggressors is that they're short range, and being able to move before firing twice really adds to the appeal of this unit. One squad of aggressors with this doctrine will pump out an average of 114 bolt shots at 18-inch range after moving, and they'll all be AP -1. With the right buffs, say Chapter Master rerolls and extra bonuses to wounds, say from a Chaplain, these guys will threaten literally anything in the game, and of course they'll absolutely destroy hordes, no questions asked. The Repulsor Executioner also loves being an Ultramarines unit because it can move a full 10 inches and still count as being stationary, so it will always be able to double fire its main cannon. This really adds to the mobility of the unit because it's got quite a lot of close range weapons it would like to be close up to shoot. Also, 10-inch movement can really be useful for getting in line of sight of certain enemy units that might be trying to hide behind terrain. Both of the Executioner's main weapons don't really care too much about not being in the Devastator doctrine as well because they've already got really good AP. There might be some more units that I've not thought about that gain similar buffs to having remained stationary in the movement phase when shooting. So if there are any other cases, please let me know down in the comments. So overall, these two traits make the Ultramarines a flexible, mobile gun line that is resilient to being locked in close combat. They'll love units that use bolt weapons of any type due to being in the tactical doctrine, and I'd say the standout units for Ultramarines are the standard bolt rifle intercessors and of course the aggressors. So let's move on to briefly talk about the unique characters. Ultramarines have quite a lot of unique units in this codex, due to Games Workshop having created quite so many special named Ultramarines characters over the years. I'm not going to cover each one in my usual detail here, as I feel that I could easily make entire videos about each one of these guys, so this is going to be a very abbreviated list based on my overall opinion of the unit. First up, we have Captain Cato Sicarius. He costs 100 points and is quite similar in stat line to the Space Marine Captain. He has a nasty power sword that gives the chance to do D3 mortal wounds in melee, and his plasma pistol can overcharge without having the chance of blowing up and killing him. His special rule can give one squad objectives secured for a turn, so that could be handy in a pinch. Overall, I probably wouldn't pay for him over a normal Space Marine Captain with the right gear. I just don't really think he does that much extra, unfortunately. Next we have Chaplain Cassius, who will set you back just 85 points. And he has a few stat line differences, including a boosted Crozius and toughness 5, but he's basically an auto-include over the standard Chaplain because he knows 2 litanies instead of 1. That basically doubles your reason to take him as a Chaplain over the standard one, so if you're playing Ultramarines, you should certainly always consider him in any list, and certainly if you're thinking about taking a standard Chaplain, just take Cassius instead. He's really good for the points. Moving on, we have the Ultramarines Chapter Ancient for 75 points. I believe he is the guy with the big banner who comes with the Ultramarines Honor Guard kit. He's 75 points, so 12 points more than a regular Company Ancient, but I'd say he's worth taking because he gets a 2-up save, a power sword, and more importantly, a 9-inch range on the banner ability. This can let your flexible Ultramarines gun line be a lot more mobile and not have to castle up quite as much, which can be quite a disadvantage. I'd certainly consider running him alongside something like Aggressors, so that when they die, they have a chance to shoot again with all of those nasty bolt shots. Next we have the Chapter Champion for 55 points. Now this guy isn't awful, but I don't think I'd run him personally. I think I would just run a fighty captain if I wanted a melee character, particularly as I'd ideally like to give a melee character a jump pack so they can actually reach melee more reliably. Next we have all new Primaris Chief Librarian Tigurius, who gains an extra wounds and attack when they made him a Primaris Marine, so he has a similar stat line to Primaris Librarians now. His Hood of Hellfire also got a really nice buff, which now adds +1 to Psychic tests and Deny the Witch tests, and he can also reroll failed Psychic power tests. He knows 3 Librarius powers and can cast 2 of them, So if you're considering a librarian for a Ultramarines force, I'd certainly consider Tigurius. He's got some of the most reliable casting in the game at the moment. And we'll talk about a few of the potential uses of the new Indomitus discipline quite soon. Next we have Honor Guard for 20 points per model. They can tank some shots for your characters if they get hit by sniper weapons, so it could be worth considering if you're running a Ultramarines list that is running a lot of characters together in a big bubble. And then we have Manius Calgar at 200 points. He's very tanky in that new armor of Heraclus, the boosted Gravis armor, as he has a 2-up armor save, a 4-up invul save, and halves incoming damage on him. He gives you those very nice Chapter Master rerolls for letting all of your Ultramarines shoot very effectively. I could see him being used in an advancing blob of Ultramarines units, providing those rerolls and then maybe getting stuck into close combat when the enemy gets too close. He'll also give you a couple of extra command points if he's your Warlord, so that's worth considering for him. Next we have Rebute Guilliman himself, who got a bit of a side grade in the new Codex. He lost his full rerolls to Wound Aura, which I honestly think was a good thing, as it made balancing Space Marine units impossible, because he just gave such ridiculous damage output buffs to anything that was next to him that it usually made sense just to take the shootiest Space Marine units and put them all around him. Now he just gives the full Chapter Master rerolls and reroll 1s to wound, which is still very good at buffing your nearby units. He dropped to 350 points in the new Codex, and his Hand of Dominion got an increase in damage to damage 4 rather than damage 3 before, so it's even better at taking out large vehicles. All in all, Guilliman is a little bit worse as a buffing force multiplier, so you're more incentivized to get more use of him as a melee character to charge forwards and kill the enemy, while also supporting the units around him. I believe he's still definitely worth considering, but he won't be quite as ubiquitous as he was before in competitive Space Marine lists. Up next we have Sergeant Kronos, a 30-point character that you can take to upgrade one of your tanks to be Ballistic Skill 2-up, and it never degrades, so it will remain at Ballistic Skill 2-up even when the tank takes damage. You can ride a Land Raider, Rhino, Razorback, Whirlwind, Predator or Vindicator to make them more accurate. As a 30-point character, he's very good for filling out Space Marine battalions, being a lot cheaper than most other HQs, so that's a really good use of him. Obviously, you'll get more use out of the 2-up ballistic skill out of the more expensive the vehicle is, so he's particularly good in, say, Land Raiders. I could see an Ultramarines Land Raider Crusader being a possibility with him in, due to those Hurricane Bolters rapid firing at 24 inches and it being able to drop back out of combat so it can still fire even if the enemy tags it with an infantry unit. Just to note, a lot of people were getting very excited about putting him in a Relic Whirlwind Scorpius. Games Workshop have stopped you doing that in a new FAQ. Next up is Sergeant Telion, a 65-point sniper character who can shoot a sniper rifle and buff some scouts a bit. I personally wouldn't take him myself unless I was really going in on a lot of sniper scouts. Then we have Tyrannic War Veterans, who are essentially Stern Guard, who come in a 4-man squad and reroll hit and wounds against Tyrannid units. Maybe they could have a place in a list if Tyrannids become a lot more common in the meta at the moment, but there aren't that many competitive lists of theirs running around. Might be one to watch if the bugs ever start to get very dominant again. And finally we have Victrix Honor Guard, which are 30 points per model. You get 2 of them armed with storm shields and fancy power swords, and like the Honor Guard, they're a perfectly reasonable choice to tank a few sniper rifle weapons that come trying to shoot your Space Marine characters, and when the enemy gets close they can charge in to lend a little bit of close combat muscle. They are an option, but I think I prefer to invest my points in units with a few more guns. And that's the end of the very big special character and special unit section that the Ultramarines get. Like I said, I'll probably cover some of these guys in unique review videos sometime over the next few months. Let's move on to the Ultramarines Warlord Traits. Firstly, and possibly best, is Adept of the Codex. This is the one that lets you regenerate a command point every time you spend a stratagem and roll a 5+ on a dice. This is particularly nice because of all of the nice new stratagems that Marines are getting these days. So having a few more CP in the bank could really mean the difference between being able to use all of the new toys to their maximum efficiency. Calgar gets this one in addition to his extra 2 CP he gives you for being his Warlord, so if you're running him then picking this will get you a lot of extra command points. Second is Master of Strategy, where once per battle round you can select a unit within 6 inches of your Warlord and that will be in the Tactical Doctrine for the rest of the turn. The only real benefit of this that I see is that it can allow you to have a unit on turn 1 in Tactical Doctrine, such as say your big unit of aggressors that you've just moved up on first turn. There's also a stratagem which we'll mention later that lets you do this, so either having the Warlord Trait or stratagem or both can be options if you really want to get the maximum amount of first turn bolter shots. After first turn it's kind of redundant because Ultramarines armies are almost always going to want to go into the Tactical Doctrine turn 2, so you won't get any more use out of this stratagem from then. Incidentally, this is Tigurius' and Telion's trait. Personally, I'd probably just take the stratagem over this, but it's quite nice if you want to have 2 units in Tactical Doctrine turn 1. Third is Calm Under Fire. This lets friendly Ultramarines within 6 inches of the Warlord fall back and still shoot, but they don't have to take the -1 penalty to hit. Now this is only a small damage output in a very niche circumstance, so I really wouldn't bother with this. It might well not come up in the entire game, and even if it does, your unit would still get to shoot anyway. It's just at a -1 penalty, which isn't really the end of the world. This is Sergeant Cronus's, interestingly enough. I could see it being particularly a bit frustrating for your opponent if you retreated with most of your tank gun line and then still shot on full ballistic skill. So that is one potential bonus, but hopefully you can avoid that situation in the first place. Next up is Paragon of War, which lets the warlords on modified wound rolls of 6 inflict mortal wounds in addition to their normal damage. This works both in ranged and melee, and is best with a warlord that has a lot of attacks. If you really wanted to max out the mortal wounds, you could maybe take a biker captain with a storm bolter with the Teeth of Terror, the relic chainsword, to give him something like 8 attacks in shooting and 8 attacks in close combat, so lots of chance for triggering those mortal wounds each turn he's active. It's not bad, but I'd probably take something like the Imperium sword instead if I wanted to buff up a captain's damage potential. This is Sicarius' trait and it's not particularly useful on him. Number 5 is Nobility Made Manifest, which is a 6-inch aura of giving Ultramarines, infantry and bikers heroic intervention. You'd want this on a warlord that's going forwards. Notably, it is Guilliman's Warlord Trait, which is interesting because if you make Guilliman your warlord, you also get 3 CP bonus, so we might well see it run on him just for that. Guilliman's quite a good model to have this on, as he'll want to be going forwards towards the enemy, surrounded by other Ultramarines units. They might actually make use of this rule. The only downside is, as it's heroic intervention, your opponent actually has to move within 3 inches of your units in either the movement phase or the charge phase to trigger it, so it's entirely on them whether or not you ever get to use this rule. A smart player will typically not need to worry about it, but as I said, it can be worth making Guilliman your warlord just for those 3 CP, so we'll often have this active when you see Guilliman on the tabletop. And finally, we have Warden of Macragge. This is 6-inch range heroic interventions, and is, in my opinion, probably the worst of the lot. Maybe occasionally it might catch out a player who forgets that you have it, but honestly, why not just take a trait that actually buffs your warlord's damage output when you get to move him, rather than hoping your opponent is going to make a mistake and put a model within 6 inches of him. All in all, I can see arguments being made for the first 5 of those traits. Bear in mind you can always buy in an extra trait with Hero of the Chapter, which is often a good idea with Adept of the Codex, as it might well pay for itself in CP if you weren't taking another Warlord trait that way. So let's move on to some relics now. Firstly, we have the Relics of Macragge, which are somewhat restricted to Ultramarine successors. Firstly, the Armour of Conor is a Terminator model only relic. It gives them a 4-up invul save and a half damage rounding up, so that means that the rules are quite similar to Marlies Calgar's rules. It further makes a survivable model more survivable, but I wouldn't count on it saving your Terminator captain if he gets caught out in the open against an entire enemy gun line. I personally prefer to take a relic that puts the damage output up on a character rather than the survivability where possible, particularly where it's a slow moving character that could be easily ignored by the enemy, such as a Terminator character. Next up is the Helm of Censure. This will give your character rerolls of hit and wound rolls of 1 just for himself, but against Space Marines or Chaos Space Marines, that changes to a +1 to hit and wound. Now this is a great relic, but not one that you should build into your list to start with. You should think about buying this in just before the battle starts with the Relics stratagem, after you've seen the opponent's list. If they're playing Space Marines or Chaos Space Marines, then this can really put the damage output on a Smash Captain through the roof. +1 to hit and +1 to wound is amazing, particularly combined with the reroll ones that they already have. For example, if you charge a Space Marine Smash Captain with a Thunderhammer into a Lord Discordant, the Helm of Censure gets you from an average of 5 wounds inflicted to an average of 8 wounds inflicted. That's a 60% damage buff, which is really good for one relic, and you can obviously combine that with other things such as the Imperium's Sword Warlord trait to make it even nastier. Next up is the Sanctic Hailer, which is only for a Captain or a Chapter Master. It gives them a 3-up invul save and lets them deny 1 power per turn as if they were a Psyker. This could be worth thinking about buying in on a Captain if you're facing a lot of Psykers, particularly one that you don't already have a Storm Shield on. Say for example a Smash Captain you've given a Storm Bolter to, or a Gravis Captain who can't take a Storm Shield. Next up is the Soldier's Blade, which can replace a Power Sword, Mastercrafted Power Sword, or Combat Blade. It's Strength +1, AP -4 and Damage 2, and it's flatly inferior to the Burning Blade, so never really take that if you're taking it instead of a Power Sword, but it could be worth thinking about if you want to buff up one of your Phobos characters to be a bit better in melee. Personally I wouldn't bother. Next we have Standard of Macragge Inviolate, which you give to an Ancient as a banner upgrade. It gives you +1 attack to any friendly Ultramarine units within 6 inches of the bearer, and friendly Ultramarine units within 12 inches auto-pass morale tests. Has the potential to be horrendously nasty if you pair it up with say a big squad of Terminators or Aggressors perhaps, but because the Chapter Ancient is quite slow you might struggle to actually get them into a position where they can charge and also be in range for his buff. Next we have the Terentian Cloak. It gives a 5+ invulnerable save, and the bearer regains D3 wounds at the start of each of your movement phases. Could potentially be a bit more useful on a model without an invul save, such as a Librarian, but you really would want that D3 regains wound ability on a very big high wound character such as say a Gravis Captain, who has a higher likelihood of being injured but not killed. As it might not necessarily help you all game long, I don't really think this is worth taking compared with some of the other relics. And the last of the Ultramarines only relics of Macragge is the Vengeance of Ultramar, a snazzy Storm Bolter that is rapid fire 4 and rerolls wounds against non-vehicles. It's not a bad little boost to your shooting. It's particularly good on say a Bite Captain, where you could have this and the Bite's Combi Bolters, giving you 12 Strength 4 shots a turn from one character, which is quite funny. Though admittedly most Space Marine lists aren't usually struggling for Strength 4 shooting these days. Next is the Special Issue War Gear, which can be freely taken by successor chapters. There's the Adamantine Mantle, which is a 5+ Feel No Pain, Artificer Armor for 2-up Armor save and a 5-up Invulnerable save, Digital Weapons for the potential to do a mortal wound in the fight phase, and Mastercrafted Weapon to add +1 damage to any weapon, which is my favourite of the bunch out of the standard ones that all Codex chapters get. Unique to the Ultramarines, however, we have Hell Fury Bolts, which is an upgrade for a standard bolt weapon. You make just one roll to hit, and if the model hits, then it inflicts 1 mortal wound. If you guarantee a captain firing this weapon all game long, then it's actually not too bad a little pickup, but usually captains have better things to be doing than firing 1 bolt shot per turn. Next is the Reliquary of Vengeance, which is a once per battle buff that allows all Space Marine units within 6 inches of the bearer to add 1 to their attacks in the coming fight phase. This has the potential to be really strong when combined with a powerful melee unit, or even just a unit of intercessors. Every model having +1 attack will often be a 33 or 50% damage increase, depending on the model. So yes, it certainly has options, this one. Then we have the Sunwrath Pistol, which is a plasma pistol with an extra shot and strength 8 all the time, no need to overheat. Not awful, but very close range and involves putting your character in harm's way. And finally, and in my opinion best, is the Seal of Oath. Basically, at the start of the battle round, before the first turn begins, you select an enemy unit, and the bearer has a 6-inch aura of full reroll hits and full reroll to wounds against that unit. Now this is an incredibly strong relic, and one that I would typically think about buying in every single game. In some games it's going to be stronger than others, say against knights. If you just nominate the scariest knight in your opponent's army, put this in the centre of your gun line, and watch as every single hit pretty much hits and wounds that knight. It really is a horrendously strong firepower buff. Even if you don't have such a massive hard target, you could just select the first units that you are planning on shooting, and watch them dissolve to your firepower very quickly. It combos very nicely with stratagems and buffs that have additional effects on rolls of 6s, and there are quite a lot of those strewn throughout the Space Marine Codex. Honestly, this is by far the most powerful relic in the Ultramarines Codex right now. So now we've done relics, let's move on to the Indomitus Discipline. So let's see what the Ultramarines librarians can be running around with. Firstly, we have Precognition for Warp Charge 5. This is a defensive buff to the librarian itself, getting a 5+ invul save, and enemy units suffer a -1 penalty to hit the librarian. Don't bother with this, there's no point buffing the defense of a unit that should be hiding behind your army anyway. Secondly, there's Scryer's Gaze, Warp Charge 7. This is really nice, as it lets you generate a command point to add to your total stock. If you've already regained or regenerated a command point this turn, then you also have the option to choose to reroll a single hit or wound or damage roll for a friendly Ultramarines unit within 18 inches of the Psyker that turn. I'd argue this is probably the best power of the discipline, particularly if you're taking someone like Tigurius with his reliable casting. He should be generating a whole bunch of command points by the end of the game, and as the Space Marine stratagems are so nasty these days, more stratagems can genuinely win games. So enough said, it's a very good power. Next we have Telepathic Assault for Warp Charge 7. Now this is an interesting power. You can pick an visible enemy unit within 24 inches and you roll 2d6 and add 2. The amount that this total beats their leadership by is the amount of mortal wounds that unit suffers. So this is a very wildly swingy power that might often do nothing at all due to its high warp charge to cast and the chance that you might roll low on the 2d6. But when you roll high, and particularly when you're against a low leadership opponent, it has the potential for doing an insane amount of mortal wounds in one go. I'd consider buying it in if I was playing against an opponent that had a big scary model with a few tough wounds but relatively low leadership. Otherwise you're probably better off sticking with Smite and other psychic powers that could achieve different things on the battlefield. Next up we have Storm of the Emperor's Wrath for Warp Charge 6, which is an anti-horde power. You cast it on an enemy unit within 18 inches, and for every model in that unit you roll a dice. If you roll a 6, then the unit takes a mortal wound. So say on a match squad of 30 orc boys, you'll be on average taking 5 mortal wounds on those boys. So in general it's a lot better than Smite against big hordes, but often big hordes don't really care that much about losing a few models here and there. They're often quite low in points cost and low in durability. So again, I'd think about picking this up against the right opponent. If they had multiple units of 30 strong models, it would certainly not be a terrible pick. Power number 5 is Psychic Shackles, Warp Charge 6. Select an enemy unit within 18 inches of the Psyker. Until the start of your next Psychic phase, they halve their move distance and a -1 to advance and assault. It's not quite as good as Tenebrous Curse from the Obscuration Discipline, but if you wanted to take a Librarius Discipline, say for Scryer's Gaze, then this would also be an option for slowing an enemy unit right down. This one does also apply to flying units, which Tenebrous Curse does not. Again, it's very matchup dependent. Certainly think about it if you're facing enemies with melee units that want to be running up the board very quickly, say a Knight Gallant. And finally we have Empiric Channeling, Warp Charge 5. Pick another Ultramarines Librarian within 12 inches and they get +2 to cast and don't suffer perils. Could be useful for powering up to get some high warp charge spells off, such as Scryer's Gaze or Null Zone if it's absolutely vital that goes off in your opponent's face in your turn. But bear in mind that you are paying a lot of points worth of Librarian just to buff another Librarian. So typically I wouldn't take this besides in some very edge case scenarios. All in all, I do quite like Scryer's Gaze, and the other ones are all situational against different opponents. So depending on the matchup, I could easily see myself using the Indomitus Discipline if I had a Psyker in the army, particularly Tigurius. Now to take a look at the Ultramarine stratagems. Firstly we have Avenge the Fallen for 1 CP. You can use this stratagem when a friendly Ultramarines unit is destroyed, and until the end of the battle, the unit that destroyed that unit is easier for your Ultramarines to hit because you get to reroll 1s when you make an attack against it for the rest of the battle. Now this is actually really quite powerful for 1 CP to have a 17% with an entire army's worth of attacks against it for the rest of the game. Certainly consider using it if, say, it's a big unit like a Knight that killed your Ultramarines unit. The only real reason not to use this is if the majority of your army is within bowls of rerolls, say with captains or chapter masters. Obviously they'll already have reroll ones, so it'll be a pointless buff. Overall though, a very good stratagem. Next we have Martial Precision. Again, this is 1 CP, and you use it with any one single attack, so that's 1 dice roll, made by an Ultramarines unit shooting a weapon in the shooting phase, and that one attack automatically hits the target. This obviously has the highest use on single shot weaponry that you don't already have a source of chapter master or captain rerolls for. I'd say it's most useful when you just need that one extra shot to finish off an enemy unit, say like a tank that's on 1 wound, or against something that's stacking multiple negative modifiers to hit, such as an Eldar flyer. It's not something that I would do every turn, but it's quite handy to have in the toolbox. So say if you can guarantee that the model goes down to that last shot, then the rest of your guns in your army can start focusing on something else. Next we have Sons of Guilliman for 1 CP. You use it when a unit with the troops battlefield roll, such as say Primaris Intercessors, attacks in the shooting or fight phase, and you can reroll all hits for that unit. Alternatively, if it doesn't have the troops battlefield roll, then you can reroll any hit rolls of 1. Both of these are respectable buffs to shooting, and are best on big units, but obviously are redundant if you have a captain or chapter master to give the similar rerolls to that unit. Again, it's not really one that I'd use every turn, but one to consider if you need one specific unit to really maximise its damage potential in your shooting phase. Next up we have Vengeance for Calth for 1 CP, and this is 4 rerolls to hit and wound in the fight phase for an Ultramarines unit that's fighting a Word Bearer unit. Obviously this is great against Word Bearers, but I've never met anyone who plays Word Bearers yet, as from a competitive point of view they aren't really very good. So it's fluffy, but irrelevant in about 99% of the games you'll play. Next we have Tactical Expertise. This is a 2 CP stratagem that you can only use once, and you can only use it when the tactical doctrine is in effect, so that's turn 2 or later. For the entirety of that shooting phase, any rapid fire or assault weapon that gets a wound of 6 to hit gains an additional 1 to its AP. As you're already in the tactical doctrine, your standard bolt gun will be AP -1, and this will put it up to AP -2 on 6s to wound. I'd strongly consider this if you're about to fire off a lot of bolters in turn 2, particularly if your opponent has hard armoured units, such as say another Space Marine player. Next we have Cycle of War for 1 CP. This will allow you to move from the Assault Doctrine back to the Devastator Doctrine and start the Doctrine's pathway again. I've never used this because I never put my Ultramarines in the Assault Doctrine, because pretty much all of their buffs come from the Tactical Doctrine. And finally we have Squad Doctrine for 1 CP. This is used at the start of your movement phase, and you select an Ultramarines infantry or biker unit from your army, and then you get to put it in either Devastator, Tactical or Assault Doctrine, and until the end of that battle round, that unit counts as having that doctrine active instead of the current one. Now this is just literally amazing on units such as Aggressors. Say if it was turn 1 and you needed to move your Aggressors 5 inches to be in range of the enemy, then this will exchange round about 60 Strength 4 AP nothing shots for about 114 Strength 4 AP -1 shots. So you have the potential to gain over 50 bolt shots and make them all AP -1 for 1 CP. This is one of the best value stratagems that you can possibly use in the right circumstances. Next up is Defensive Focus for 2 CP. If the enemy charges one of your units, then 3 of your units within 6 inches can also fire Overwatch at the unit that charged. This could be potentially devastating to a vulnerable unit that is attempting to charge your lines. The first thing that springs to mind is something like Genestealer Cults, who typically have horrendously hard-hitting units that aren't really that tough to your own shooting. A stratagem like this could really take the force out of that charge. Also bear in mind that if you have a chapter master nearby, your Overwatch gets massively better due to being able to reroll all your hit rolls. And this could be worth doing even against a hard target that you're not ever going to stop getting into close combat, just for a massive amount of extra damage on the unit. Say if you had a bunch of repulsors sat next to the squad that's being charged. So yeah, certainly possible. Next is Fall Back and Re-engage, which costs 1 CP if you're pure Ultramarines, or 2 CP if you're a successor chapter. This essentially lets you fall back, shoot again, and then charge again in the assault phase. Could be very useful on something such as Aggressors, or Terminators, or any other unit that can get a lot of utility out of both shooting again and then charging again. Not bad for potentially only 1 CP. Next is Courage and Honor, which will allow you to add 1 to the leadership of all Ultramarines units in your army for the morale phase. Ultramarines are already pretty leadership immune in the first place, so this isn't going to be most useful most of the time. But say if you did somehow have multiple 10-man units that have taken a lot of casualties, then this could actually save you a model or 2. Still not particularly overwhelming. Next is Inspiring Command for 1 CP, which you can use at the start of the shooting or fight phase. During that phase you pick a Chapter Master, Captain or Lieutenant, and their aura abilities are increased by 3-inch range, so it could be very good if you had a Chapter Master and you really needed a little bit of bonus range on his aura to affect a key unit. Ideally you'd want to avoid having to use this by positioning properly, but if you are caught out and you absolutely need those rerolls, then it's definitely worth a CP. We have Rapid Deployment, 2 CP, a very powerful stratagem this one. At the start of the battle round, but before the first turn begins, select up to 3 Ultramarine units from your army and remove them from the battlefield. You then get to reset them up as described in the deployment section for the mission. So it's basically a counter-deploy stratagem. If you set up first and have the first turn, you can use this stratagem to reposition your units to react to what your opponent has done, and have 3 critical units in the right position to deal maximum damage on your first turn. That's potentially very, very strong, particularly if you use it on those new Invicta warsuits, which can position themselves for the ideal charge turn 1. Very nasty indeed. We then have Tactical Insight for 2 CP. This is for use in Maelstrom missions and lets you discard your hand of Maelstrom objectives and draw new ones. This might be a bit of a toss-up as it does cost 2 CP, but if you draw an awful hand turn 1, then I'd certainly think about doing this, as victory points are what wins games and this could get you more victory points. The last 3 stratagems are generic to all of the new supplement books. We've got Exemplar of the Chapter, which can be used to stack an additional Warlord trait on your Warlord, provided he isn't a named character. You could get Honoured by Macragge, which is 1 CP, to allow a successor chapter access to the main Relics of Macragge list, and they can take 1 relic from that. And you can get Honoured Sergeant for 1 CP, which basically gives you the option to give a sergeant a relic, the best of which is usually going to be the mastercrafted weapon for more damage, in my opinion. So all in all, the Ultramarines are a tactically flexible army that are quite mobile while maintaining a good amount of firepower, and are particularly strong with bolt weapons. Let's have a look at an example Ultramarines list to see what we can make when we put it all together. Now this is just an example, I'm not saying it's the strongest Ultramarines list by any means, but I've just used a few of the nastiest units and some of the combos the Ultramarines have available. The core of the list is a character bubble around Cassius, Marnius Calgar, a Lieutenant, Tigurius and a Chapter Ancient. They'll be starting in the centre of the board alongside 2 squads of 6 aggressors, and supported by a bunch of intercessors with bolt rifles. They'll be advancing up the board, and between the various buffs of rerolls to hit, rerolls to wound, and Cassius's +1 to wound litany, the aggressors should be able to put a decent amount of hurt on virtually any unit that gets in their way. If I'm going second, I'd ideally try and deploy the aggressors at the front of the deployment zone, but as shielded from line of sight or in cover as possible. If the enemy does kill them, however, then they'll have a reasonable chance of shooting him straight back in the same turn, potentially putting more damage on their enemy units. I'd use the stratagem first turn to make one of them double fire after moving by putting them in the tactical doctrine, so that would be a lot of bolt shots unless they are outranged. I've also thrown in 2 Invictas, which could either be used offensively to threaten first turn charges, or defensively as part of the buff bubble to move forward and lay down some firepower with those autocannons and heavy stubbers and things. They're also a decently scary close combat threat, and you could use the Ultramarine stratagem to redeploy units to set up some perfect charges on your first turn. There's 2 battalions for a bunch of command points. Marnius Calgar is the Warlord, giving another couple of command points, and also his Warlord trait will let you regenerate when you use stratagems, so you can afford to be fairly liberal with them in this list. Besides that, I've also included 3 Hunters, the Space Marine anti-air tank, just because that gives some really good quality long-range anti-tank shots, and they're also unreasonably hard to remove, being toughness 8. and 11 wounds for only 75 points. I've also just done a video on them, which may be why they're a bit more at the forefront of my mind for Space Marine list building. I'd say this list would be very strong against mainly infantry based lists, or anything that wants to come forward and meet the aggressors head on. It would be weaker against longer ranged, particularly against armies with a lot of armour, as I don't actually have that much anti-armour in this list, even though AP-1 bolters with loads and loads of shots will do work. I think the Ultramarines are certainly a decently competitive army. Their doctrine is strong, they have strong relics, stratagems, and access to a whole bunch of special characters, some of whom are very good for their points indeed, particularly you, Mr. Cassius. I think they're on similar footing with the Raven Guard and Iron Hands codexes, which I've also done reviews of. Iron Hands are generally stronger for raw power, and Raven Guard have more sneaky, disturbing stratagems and combos, and I think that Ultramarines is somewhat of a balance between these two extremes. I'll hopefully be able to get my White Scars Codex review uploaded for next week, so feel free to subscribe if you'd like to check that out. And we'll be continuing with Tank Week this week, looking at the motor pool of the Space Marines, and hopefully crushing some heretics and Xenos under our iron treads. There are a lot of subtle rules in this book, so if I've missed anything or undervalued anything because of an important rule, please let me know down in the comments. I'm certainly keen to improve mine and all of our understandings of this new book. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics review, and I'll see you guys in the next video.